All righty. Hello, everyone, and good evening. It is 6 o'clock, so I will start our introduction, and just whoever will come in late, they can come in late. It's virtual after all, so it's it's not like having to slam doors on the way in. Welcome to tonight's 40th annual Meyer Nathan Lecture. My name is Bo Burkhart. I am a second year student. I study history and technical theater. I am the vice president of History Club, and I am your host tonight. Tonight, our Meyer Nathan lecture is on conversation on women's suffrage. And just some background history to what the Meyer Nathan lecture event is it is a event that was created in honor of a history professor from CSU named Meyer Nathan. He taught he started teaching in 1965, and he had earned his bachelor's from Rice University, his master's from Columbia, and his PhD from Princeton. And he became one of the campus's most beloved history professors, as he was very outspoken. He was very caring for his students, and he had a huge voice towards the social justice movements of the 60s. And sadly, he passed away in 1981. And after that, the history department created the Meyer Nathan Lectures in honor of his memory, and to encourage students to continue free thinking and having conversations that may be difficult, or just having conversations and keeping people talking. So tonight, our topic is conversations on women's suffrage, as the 2019-2020 year was the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified, allowing women to vote. And so we are going to focus on talking about women's suffrage and how that played out locally, as well as how women of color, how they had a part to play and how they were affected by that whole movement as well. And tonight we have three wonderful speakers who very graciously gave us their time and commitment tonight to spend with us and give us some wonderful words. We have Patti Smith, who is from a local nonprofit called Living Her Legacy, and they work to inspire women across Northern Colorado. And recently they have been approved to create the first historic public art and education exhibit in Fort Collins that recognizes women's accomplishments, and that will be open in the upcoming year by Coopersmiths in downtown. So that's very nice. And also with us is Leslie Moore, who earned her undergrad from Carleton College. She has worked for several years as an educator in the Minnesota Historical Society, and then she earned her master's here at CSU. She graduated this past spring and now works as an architectural historian and has done a lot of work locally as well regarding studying women's suffrage and women's history here in Fort Collins. And lastly, we have Dr. Caridad Souza, who is who works here at CSU as well. She is the director of the Center of Women's Studies and Gender Research, and her areas of interest and expertise include race and ethnic relations in theory, poverty, multiracial and decolonial feminisms, critical ethnography, good Lord, and many other areas of interest. So we have some very, very, very excellent speakers tonight. And for our moderator, we have our own Dr. Little. And just so everyone knows, we have this set up so that everyone will be muted unless our host gives permission. And otherwise, so if anyone has any questions or comments during this, you can type it in the chat, and Dr. Little will get those questions asked to our speakers at the end of the event. So without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Dr. Little so we can get things started.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great honor to moderate this year's Meyer Nathan Lecture. I believe it's the 40th anniversary. Is that right? The 40th Meyer Nathan Lecture. And to be here with such a distinguished group of women to hear from. Patti Smith of Living Her Legacy, Dr. Caridad Souza, and Leslie Moore, one of my old friends and students who just graduated, as Bo just suggested. So I will turn it over, I believe, to Patti. Are you up first?
I wasn't sure. I have Leslie on my list as being first from what the students sent us. Did you want me to start or did you want Leslie to start? Okay.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today. I'm really excited. Like Dr. Little said, I'm going to be discussing how the women's suffrage movement played out in Fort Collins specifically. And that story really begins a few decades before the passage of the 19th Amendment. So we're going all the way back to the 1880s. And the real roots of the movement lie actually in the temperance movement. And just a little reminder, the temperance movement was this big push to pass laws that would restrict or outright prohibit the sale of liquor. And this was something that a lot of women at Fort Collins were particularly concerned about. There had been a few instances around this time of men drinking too much at some of the local bars, not making it at home and dying or almost dying of exposure. There was also a really horrific domestic abuse homicide in Fort Collins related to alcohol use. And so a lot of Fort Collins women felt that Fort Collins would only really thrive and attract new families if they could get some temperance laws passed. So a group of white middle-class women started a local chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. And these women would meet about once a week in each other's parlors throughout the 1880s, 1890s. And they would share ideas, they would talk about other temperance leaders, and they would also discuss strategies for getting some of these laws passed. And one strategy that gained a lot of popularity in the 1880s around the nation was the idea that if most supporters of the temperance movement are women, if we can just get women the right to vote, then these laws are finally going to get passed. And so the local WCTU chapter were also adamant supporters of women's suffrage. You really can't make a distinction between the two movements in Fort Collins. They were one in the same. Now I hope you guys all noticed I was really specific with my language. I said that these were white middle-class women who were part of the local chapter of the WCTU. We know that there were people of color living in Fort Collins. There were working class immigrant families in Fort Collins at this time. Unfortunately, those women's perspectives on suffrage are not readily available in the historical record, though I challenge some of you budding historians to dig something up that I couldn't find. But something that we do know for certainty is that the local leaders of the WCTU had a lot of prejudices and a lot of discrimination towards people of color and towards immigrants. So for example, Lucy McIntyre was the on and off again president of the WCTU. And in the early 1890s, she writes a letter to the editor of the Fort Collins Courier advocating for women's suffrage. But one of the arguments that she makes is that if women get the right to vote, then white educated women, their vote can balance out the voting power of uneducated immigrant men. So she was using xenophobic fears at the time to support the passage of women's suffrage. A statewide leader of the WCTU also gave a speech that was printed in the Fort Collins paper, where she makes a similar argument as McIntyre, but instead she says, if we pass women's suffrage nationwide, there are more white women in the United States than there are Black men and women combined. So if you give women suffrage, you can outpower the voting power of all Black Americans. So it's not hard to imagine that any women of color or working class immigrant women in Fort Collins probably were not welcomed into this this middle class white movement. They were not welcomed into the parlors of the WTCU leaders in Fort Collins. And that is probably a reason why we're not seeing their voices in the historical record. Now in 1893, Colorado women get the opportunity to finally get suffrage. A referendum was added to the ballot that year, asking Colorado voters if Colorado women should gain their suffrage. Now remember, all Colorado voters in 1893 were men. So Colorado suffragists had about 9 months to convince men to give them the votes. And the Fort Collins leaders of the WCTU got to work right away. They started a separate Equal Suffrage Association in Fort Collins, and they invited men to be a part of that association. And then they came up with one really smart strategy. They recruited several of those men to travel around Larimer County giving speeches on behalf of the referendum. And this was a smart strategy because at the time, it was still a little socially inappropriate for women to be giving speeches in the public. To be overly politically involved might threaten some male voters. And so by asking men to campaign on their behalf, the Fort Collins suffragists were eliminating the possibility of alienating some male voters in Larimer County. And this strategy seemed to work. In the months leading up to the November election, the papers report growing support for the referendum. But the final push was just a week before the election, and Carrie Chapman Catt, a national suffrage leader, actually came to Fort Collins, and she gives a speech in the Opera House right on College Avenue. And this brings a huge crowd. Catt was a household name at the time, and she was a fantastic speaker. And so the hubbub of her visit drew some last minute attention to the ballot, to the referendum on the ballot. And it all paid off. Larimer County votes in favor of women's suffrage pretty handedly. It passes statewide. And a few weeks later, the Equal Suffrage Association throws a big jubilee and celebration, a big party. There was music, lots of guests, lots of toasts, absolutely no alcohol whatsoever. And then those women got to work. They had their first chance to participate in an election the following spring. It was a city election, and 46% of voters who turned out that day were women. So Fort Collins women were really eager to take advantage of this new political right that they had. Now, of course, there's another asterisk here. Native American women and Chinese American women still did not gain the right to vote in Colorado. So women's suffrage did not equal to universal suffrage. Those women wouldn't get the right to vote for a few more decades. One Fort Collins woman went a step beyond just participating in elections. She actually ran for city council the following year in 1895, and Alice Edwards ends up winning that election by just a few votes, but she did win. And she's thought to be the very first woman to be elected to city office in Colorado. Unfortunately, we know very little about her, other than the fact that she ran on the temperance ticket. And within the year, prohibition is passed within the boundaries of Fort Collins. So Fort Collins women saw a need for their community. They advocated for their political rights, and that change ended up coming about, which is a really impressive feat. There was a lot of pressure on all Colorado women in the next 2 decades. There were people from around the country, from around the world, who had their eyes on Colorado, waiting for an example of women voters screwing up, or waiting for an example of them achieving great political things. And that was a lot of pressure to be an exemplary political citizen. Theodosia Abrams, the first female dean at CSU, continued to be involved in the national suffrage movement in the early 1900s. And if you look at her correspondence, which is in the university archives, she was just constantly writing letters to people, reassuring them that Colorado thought that women's suffrage had been a success, and they did not regret giving women the vote whatsoever. And those sort of reassurances continue all the way up to the 19th Amendment. Colorado ratifies the 19th Amendment without any hesitation. And when it finally passes in 1920, you see Fort Collins women celebrate all over again, that their sisters across the country now had the same rights that they had. I think if we look back at the Fort Collins suffrage movement, to me, there are two really important takeaways. The first is that women saw a need for their community, and they found a way to bring that need about. They saw a cause and they advocated for that cause, and it was successful. It took a long time, but it was successful. In this case, passing temperance laws. And that's something that we should remember, that change can happen on the local level. But I think the second big takeaway is that Fort Collins suffragettes brought about that change at the cost of pushing others down, not including women of color, not including working class women, immigrant women in their movement. So there was clearly mistakes made. And so I guess I challenge all of you guys, I challenge myself to think about the causes we really care about, and then to think about whose voices are not being included or being purposely discluded, and really working to bring those voices into the conversation, and to not repeat the mistakes that our foremothers made. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
All right, now we have Patti Smith. Sorry for introducing her prematurely. Thank you very much, Leslie. It's good to see you, and good to see that your interest in Fort Collins history is still going strong. Patti, would you like to take it now?
Thank you, Dr. Little. Appreciate it. And thank you very much to the CSU History Club for inviting me to come and share with you today. We're very honored we have been approved to create the first historic public art education exhibit in Fort Collins, recognizing women's accomplishments. And our first set of portraits will go up the end of March in Old Town on the north side of Cooper Smith's Pool Table Restaurant. So if you're downtown, we have an information window up currently that we put up August 30th. Stop by and you can see what it will look like. I'd like to begin by sharing a local suffragist. Leslie shared as well, Theodosia Grace Ammons. She is one of our legacy honorees. She was a Fort Collins, Colorado, and American suffragist, as Leslie shared. Theodosia traveled locally and nationally in support of the suffragette movement. She worked extensively throughout her life to advance the cause of women's suffrage, and she was the co-founder with Eliza Pickrell Rout of the Department of Domestic Economy at Colorado Agricultural College. And she was also the first female dean at the college, which today, of course, is CSU. And Theodosia is being recognized as one of our legacy honorees in our Living Her Legacy Historic Public Art Exhibit. Okay, next. There is a picture of Theodosia, and she lived from 1862 to 1907. Next slide, please. So, did votes for women really mean votes for Black women? Not really. The 1913 suffragist march in Washington, D.C., Black women are absent in the photos. Black women were asked to march in the back, and they did not, of course, want to do that. And Ida B. Wells was an African-American civil rights advocate, a journalist, and a feminist, and she was there with her Illinois women's group. And so she walked to the side, and as her women's group marched down the street, she jumped in the middle of the parade and marched with her Illinois women's group. And African-American activist Mary Churchill Terrell said that there was a double burden of blackness and womanhood at that time as well. She said, you know, we have two strikes against us. And she was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She's an American hero. She fought tirelessly for the right of all women to vote, despite facing racism within the suffrage movement. And she stated that with this double burden of blackness and womanhood, African American women approached the suffrage movement with different objectives than their white counterparts. They were painfully aware of the restrictions on Black male voting in the South and the social, political, and economic challenges facing their communities. Black women saw their enfranchisement as an opportunity for community uplift as well as personal recognition of citizenship. Next slide, please. So the suffragette movement for all women, or was it just for white women? Well, Susan B. Anthony had said, she was one of the main movers and shakers in the suffragette movement. She openly had said, if only one group were to be given the vote, it should be white women. And in 1901 and 1903, the National American Women's Suffrage Association held conventions, and they barred African Americans from attending. And W.E. Du Bois, in 1911, he was the editor for over 25 years of the Crisis magazine. He openly wrote that he was opposed of the leaders from the Women's Suffrage Association because of its poor outreach to Black communities. And the Crisis magazine is one of the longest published magazines considered to be one of the oldest Black publications still to this day. Next slide, please. Some interesting facts to share. First Women's Right Convention met in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, which initiated the women's suffrage movement. The Wyoming Territory was the first to grant women the vote in 1869, and Colorado was the second state to grant women the right to vote in 1893, but the first state by referendum, the popular vote that Leslie talked about. The first suffragette march was in Washington, D.C. in 1913. Although the white women started this project, the African American women actually had started working on their rights long before the suffragette movement was ever begun. There were women who wanted to be preachers, and so they were working on different ways of what they had to do so that they could have expanded rights. The first suffragette march was in 1913, and the amendment passed in 1920 giving women the right to vote, yet state restrictions remained a problem. The white women were afraid that if they let Black women participate and the issue of racism came up, they would lose the votes from the southern states, and they didn't want to take that chance. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is when it actually opened up the doors to voting for African Americans, several decades later, after 1920. And of course, the 100th anniversary of the Equal Rights Amendment, which the name was changed to, was in August of last year, which was a huge celebration. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful event. Next slide, please. Some of the key people, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner was a former slave And she became an outspoken advocate for abolition, temperance, and civil and women's rights in the 19th century. She was famous for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" But there's some controversy about that somebody else had rewritten her speech a little bit after that, and really they said that she really didn't say that in the first place. So there's some controversy there. Sojourner Truth was able to get away from her slave owner with her daughter, and 2 years later she took her slave owner to court to get custody of her son. And she was the first Black woman to win custody over a white man at that time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the author, lecturer, and chief philosopher of the women's rights and suffrage movements. She formulated the agenda for the women's rights that guided the struggle well into the 20th century. And Alice Paul, who was the vocal leader of the 20th century suffrage movement, advocated for the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, and she authored the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. So you see our dates. Sojourner Truth was born in 1797. Alice Paul passed away in 1997. Long history of women being involved in this process. Next slide, please. Every word we utter is being created by Jane Decker, a Loveland sculptor. It will be housed in Washington, D.C. as they get it done. They're raising funds for it right now. It has been approved, and the final step was approved just recently last fall for them to be able to actually put it up. She lives in Loveland, and the suffragette women depicted are Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blanche, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells. This sculpture is going to sit right across the street from the Supreme Court. There is a corner that's like a triangular shape of property, and they have gotten it approved from the National Park Service that they can utilize that space. So that's extremely exciting. You can learn more about this project at everywordweutter.com. Next slide, please. I wanted to celebrate today's suffragette, Stacey Abrams. She organized the Georgia statewide Get Out the Black Vote campaign, initiated the Fair Fight group to ensure everyone's voices will count in every election. She's an American politician, a lawyer, a voting rights activist, and an author. She has some very good books you could look up to read. She served in the Georgia House of Representatives and as a minority leader. She was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States in Georgia in 2018, and she was recently nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her work on voter registration and rights, actually from somebody from Scotland. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I want to share a statement from Lynn Twist, the Soul of Money Institute. As human beings, we are the great creators of the future. And as Amanda Gorman's words so accurately state in the Washington Post month-long tribute, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. The future will become what we want it to be, what we create it to be. So despite where we are in these uncertain times, we still have the power to choose what we create. What is your dream for those that come after you? I leave you with this question. What will you help create for the future? Thank you all very much for allowing us to come and visit with you this evening.
Thanks, Patti. That was terrific. What a great introduction to sort of a broader national view of the women's suffrage movement. And next up, we have Caridad Souza from CSU's Women's Studies Department.
Someone co-host me so that I can share a slide at some point. I'm going to talk just a little bit about women of color and suffrage, because as everybody has already pointed out, there were some serious tensions around race, ethnicity, class, ability, right, in the suffrage movement. And so I just kind of want to contextualize a little bit and talk a little bit about what this movement ends up being. In fact, the 19th Amendment is really a product of a mass movement, right, of advocates for women's suffrage. So we want to talk about it in a broader sense. So we want to talk about it nationally and locally. We also want to talk about it as a movement, right, that included lots of different kinds of people, right, tens of thousands of people actually, and it included women, and it also included some men. And I'm gonna sort of just go through some slides and show you some of the faces of women of color who have been and who were involved in the beginning, late 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century in suffrage. But I want to say a few things first. And so, for example, that passage of the 19th Amendment, keeps women of color, and on the one hand, right, there's this idea that women of color should be voting and can vote, and there's all of this activity. So Patti notes that there's activity, right, early on, even before suffrage becomes a movement among women of color, and specifically African American women, right? So they're already mobilizing in very specific kinds of ways around suffrage, around other issues, around lynching, around rape, around temperance, right? So there was a lot of already established movement that leads and fits into the suffrage movement. After, so this is before the 19th Amendment in the 20s, right? Women of color, of course, are racially and ethnically discriminated against, and they're discouraged to vote. Men of color are discouraged to vote, and women of color are also discouraged to vote. And we begin to think about this relationship between women of color and suffrage, right? What you begin to see is these fault lines, these racial fault lines, these class fault lines, and often even regional fault lines, right? So what's happening in the Northeast versus what's happening in the Southeast in relationship to suffrage. Also, we want to think about what's happening abroad. That is, for example, there were in the 1920s, a group of Puerto Rican women from the island came to the United States to talk to Congress about suffrage. Right, so we have lots of different kinds of people agitating in different contexts for the suffrage and for, again, the right to vote. We often forget that, and when we're talking, the sort of mainstream sources often only talk about those very elite women and/or middle-class white women who were part of suffrage. That movie, Iron-Jawed Angels, right, does an interesting take or perspective, but leaves out a lot. So these tensions and disagreements around race and ethnicity and region and class, right, is strategic. That is, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are in many ways catering to Southern racists and nativists in order to build support for their case, right? So they develop different kinds of arguments around suffrage that is really premised on white supremacy and on class privilege. And so there are a number of different historians that we can point to. One of my favorites is Rosalind Terburg Penn, right, who talks about African American women and does a really beautiful take on the way in which middle-class, able-bodied, and white narratives were part of the struggle for the vote. There are different constituencies, however, that fought, and I'm gonna go through some of the sort of early suffragettes from Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx perspectives, just to show you. But really, this question about how to get this amendment passed and how to politically enfranchise different groups of people were, of course, very, very contentious kinds of arguments. Patti does a nice job of laying out some of the tensions and the ways in which, for example, African American women were always shafted, right, in these different contexts. Sojourner Truth, of course, is one of those people that gets attributed to, the Ain't I a Woman phrase gets attributed to her because she was present, right, in Seneca Falls, and certainly there's controversy, but the idea that she was present and she was there and that she had something to say about suffrage and about the condition, right, of African American people is an important statement. So in many ways, so suffrage passes, and despite its passage, right, people still get excluded. So you've got the 19th Amendment, and of course there's the amendment, and there's the sort of the application or the enforcement of the amendment, and that's where we see a fallout or a drop. I love how Leslie talked about local context and the way that local arguments develop, because in many ways they reflect what's happening nationally and what's happening in other regions. That is, there is a discourse on the ground that is about excluding, right, specific kinds of people in lieu of people who have privilege, racial privilege, class privilege, right? So we have a situation where despite the passage of the 19th Amendment, you have most African American, Latinx, and indigenous, Asian American, and disabled women, right, don't have the right to vote. Indigenous women are different, right, because indigenous populations are sovereign, right? Those are sovereign nations. And so for them, right, they have no constitutional right to vote until the Citizenship Act of 1924, right? But it takes a long time for all these groups to actually be able to participate in voting. There's certainly a struggle in a number of different battles. African American women in the South were barred from voting because of racist laws, right, for a very long time. And it's the historian Martha Jones who writes mostly about this and talks about the way in which it's the 1965 Voting Rights Act that really enfranchises African American women. In this country. So it's equally important to commemorate, the milestones of suffrage, such as the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, the 1986 Immigration Amnesty Act, and then of course the 1924 law granting U.S. citizenship to Native Americans. Those legislations create the possibilities to exercise suffrage, right? Not so much that they do, but at least the possibility. Right. So full enfranchisement requires further mobilization and advocacy. And if we're looking at what's happening today, I'm going to just bring it up to the present day, right? The struggle for suffrage is still here with us, just like the struggle to integrate is still very much a part of who we are. The struggle for suffrage is still very much a part of how we think and how we act. So, in the end, right, the strategy to gain a transformative power to disrupt systems of oppression, right, such as feminist prison abolitionists remind us that is voting and electoral politics are still a useful tool, right, for harm reduction. So on the one hand, right, there's this tension with suffrage and with voting and with participatory, or electoral politics, right? And on the other hand, right, they're very much needed. So we find ourselves in this very conflictual situation where on the one hand, it can be a tool to reduce harm. On the other hand, right, there's still a lot of struggle and tension around. And if we're paying attention to the way in which voting suppression happens in this country, it's interesting to hear, right, the people who are the loudest sort of voices are the very people that are responsible and have historically been responsible for voter suppression in this country, right? So, again, some of the contradictions we're living today. This last presidential election, right, the question of access to franchisement, has been front and center. There have been various strategies, right, like voter ID laws, gerrymandering, disenfranchisement of the convicted, felons, for example, and refusal to make Election Day a national holiday, which really in many ways creates a barrier for voting. The whole question of mail-in voting also, right, has been in many ways has been deployed to produce a situation where people are disenfranchised. So suffrage, right, is very much a part. So it's a historical movement that is very much still with us, right? And so as we celebrated the anniversary of suffrage last year, many of us were sort of, again, very, very cautious in talking about how to think about suffrage. That is, that there are lots of different ways that we need to think of suffrage intersectionally. Right. And that intersectional perspective includes a number of different kinds of people. So I just want to share some slides because I want you to see some faces of people who were involved initially. And of course, I love Patti's going to Stacey Abrams, right, as a sort of contemporary. That was beautiful, Patti, and I really enjoyed that because, of course, that's true. I'm just going to talk. So I like to always include Frederick Douglass, who gets forgotten, right, as somebody who was absolutely committed to women's suffrage, and who argued, right, he can't, as a man, feel comfortable voting if women are not going to vote as well. So here's Sojourner Truth, here's Ida B. Wells. I actually love Ida B. Wells. She's one of my favorite sort of 19th and 20th century people. But because of her journalism and because of her advocacy, but certainly Frederick Douglass deserves a place here among African American suffragists. Asian American women were also, of course, involved. Here's one person, right? Mabel Ping Li Huang. She was again born in China but raised in New York City and was pretty prominent, doing the kind of work, the kind of intersectional work, right? Looking at community and women's rights simultaneously, right? So here's that intersectional perspective, right? You've got to think about racialization, you've got to think about class, community, and of course, gender. So all of the suffragettes that were women of color had very complicated and sort of inclusive ideas. Here are three other indigenous women. This woman, Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin from North Dakota, from Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, was again a very outspoken indigenous woman, strong advocate for suffrage, participated in a number of different political activities, but also was prominent, right, in terms of her voice, and even talked to President Wilson, right, Woodrow Wilson, about supporting indigenous women in terms of suffrage. This is Gertrude. This photo here is a woman named Gertrude Simmons Bannon, also known as Sitkala Sa, who was born outside of Washington, D.C., and was part, again, of the suffrage movement, both in relationship to white middle-class women and upper-class women, but also in relationship to the Society of American Indians. She was a writer, a journalist, a lobbyist in Congress. She gets, again, very little information about her. Suzette LaFlèche Tibbles was also an advocate among Native Americans, but also, in the larger society around suffrage, thinking through, again, how to understand the context of indigenous people in relationship to what suffrage might look like. She was also, again, a speaker, so she had a prominent role in terms of speaking, and she moved around the country a lot. A last person I want to bring up is Jovita Idar, who actually is a project called the Southwestern Hispanic Periodicals Project, and she was discovered in Texas because she was a journalist and activist, right, and a suffragette. She was discovered through that project. Very, very prominent voice, connected to the Mexican Revolution on the one hand, but also working in Texas, and she's from El Paso, thinking through suffrage. And she's actually credited with that phrase, when you educate a woman, you educate her family. So here we are, right, sort of thinking about suffrage in ways that are and still, again, very narrow. And I love my two panelists and how they've sort of framed their conversation and their comments, because they've amplified and expanded how to think about suffrage and how to think about suffrage that is as a movement that actually is still very much with us today. So those are my comments. And oh, by the way, thank you, History Club, for inviting me.
Thanks, Caridad. That was really terrific. And thanks for putting sort of, photographic faces to some of those names that we've heard of before and some that we haven't necessarily. All right, I'm going to turn everything over to all of you in the audience who have any questions for Leslie or for Patti or for Caridad. Professor Souza, please type them up in the chat and let me know. I'm going to maybe start things off with a question of mine. And this is maybe for either Leslie or Patti. I'm not sure whom to direct this to, whoever has the knowledge, and Caridad as well, you too. But I was wondering about any influence from over the border in Wyoming. As Patti's slide showed, Wyoming was the first state to adopt women's suffrage. And we know that they did that mostly because they wanted to achieve statehood, right? They permitted women to vote because it would help them find more voters, twice the number of voters, in fact, almost exactly, in terms of getting a number of voters to vote for statehood, or to achieve Wyoming statehood. I was wondering if you all know, is there any kind of cross-border influence or any kind of collaboration between Fort Collins feminists and Wyoming feminists? Is there any kind of connection there that you're aware of?
One thing I saw in the newspaper records, the Fort Collins papers kept track of what was happening in Wyoming over in the late 19th century. So they were regularly reporting on how women were voting in Wyoming. So you have that influence. People were aware of what was happening over the border. The only other thing I really saw was right after the passage of the 1893 referendum, a Wyoming woman writes an open letter to all Colorado women, warning them of the pressure that's going to be on them now that they have the right to vote. And she says something like, you're going to have to vote, you're going to have to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. So she was referring to her own experience as a voter and trying to pass some of that knowledge on to Colorado women. But I didn't come across any like direct conversations or meetings between Wyoming suffragettes and Colorado suffragettes. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I didn't come across it in Fort Collins specifically.
I didn't find any cross-reference there either. I think it was a bit of a competition that Wyoming was first, and they knew that the Western states could probably do this faster than some of the others. So I think there was what I found was, I think, a bit of a competition there to follow suit.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a question here. Savvy, you want to ask a question of the panel?
Yes, I do. Just a quick note, Dr. Little, we can't actually type the questions to you because we can only type things to the host. Just so you know.
Yeah, I know there seems to be a problem getting us hooked up to the chat. So thank you.
It's okay. I just want to make sure you knew. My question is actually for Cardi. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names. I'm horrible with names. Sorry, I am like the worst. But Souza, thank you.
Dr. Souza, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in learning about women who were disabled of the time. I'm very much into advocacy issues, and you had noted some of it, but I was wondering if there were any specific women that were in the movement that were disabled at the same time.
Caridad, you're muted still.
So that I know of, no, that there weren't specifics. What I do know is that advocacy, that there was some thinking about suppressing anybody again. So New York City, you all must have talked and learned about some of the ways in which immigrant sort of populations were dealt with, right? In terms of, and specifically, the suffragettes, right? In relationship to how they understood and talked about immigrants. So what I was saying was that there's a similar way in which disabled people, right? Disabled people, and also, of course, people who were disabled or who were mentally ill were used or talked about in relationship to disposable bodies that should not be enfranchised politically. So I don't know any specific disabled people that were advocates, but I do, again, there's very much a huge discourse on disability and its sort of problematic nature for citizenship.
Great, thank you. Leslie or Patty, did you have anything to add to that? No, okay, all right. Looks like we have another question from Dallin.
Hello, I guess this question is specifically for Dr. Moore because it kind of falls in line with what you were talking about. The question of like the temperance movement in Colorado specifically kind of has some interesting connotations from some work I've done in different classes due to the sadly strong presence of the KKK in Colorado's history and the KKK's presence in the temperance movement. So I was wondering if there's any things you came into when doing some of your research about the women's movement here in Colorado specifically as tied to the KKK.
That's a good question. and you do give me too much credit, no doctorate yet. At the time, you really see the KKK come to power in Colorado in the early 1920s. Less so in the 1890s when the referendum was being debated. So I didn't come across anything in the newspaper records in Fort Collins related to the KKK. But like I said, certainly racist beliefs in the movement in the 1890s. So not necessarily the KKK, but those white supremacist beliefs were certainly evident. And so you kind of have to move forward to the 1920s to dig into that a little bit more.
Alan, can I ask about your interest in the KKK specifically? Because, you know, part of the context that emerges with suffrage is this question of nativism, right? And a number of different legislations. So what's your interest? Why did you ask that question? I'm curious.
Well, I'm very
What are you
interested
thinking?
I'm very interested in Colorado history specifically, but also I've taken a class that dealt quite specifically with the Ku Klux Klan. Specifically, a lot of it was in Colorado due to, you know, the professor working here and things like that. So he focused on it. And I really learned, it was really just stunning to learn that Colorado specifically was such a hot spot for their activity. And that's obviously because of it being a less populated Western state at the time that people would move into. But I guess my interest in it is it's almost like a safeguard. Like I just want to make sure I'm educated and knowledgeable about any potential modern day presence they might have in this region. So
Thanks for that. I was curious. I was just curious because context that we're talking about, right? Late 19th century into the 20s. There's so much going on around nativist sentiment, right? Generally, that almost sort of in many ways cancels out the KKK because we've got, you know, so like more recently we have people, you know, elected officials and all kinds of people talking in very racialized and racist kinds of ways, right, about these populations, so that it almost does. You don't even need, I think, the KKK really. The language that a lot of the suffragists used was absolutely eugenicist, right? And so it's racist and it's eugenicist. And that was my comment back to Savvy, is this idea that there was a eugenicist sort of stream to how the suffragette discourse and thinking, right, and consciousness emerges.
Okay, are there any other questions?
I'm gonna jump in real quick.
Yeah.
Dr. Souza, if you could go to the 3 dots by my name and make me host real quick, I can fix the chat so that everybody can see it. So, thank you.
I'm trying to see how to make you host. How about here? I'm trying to see. It doesn't allow me to make you host. Somebody else probably can do that.
All right. Thank you.
Are there any other questions that anybody has? Either raise your hand or go ahead and speak up. I can't see any questions in the chat either. And I don't know how to return that to Gus. Well, we are without a chat right now. So if anybody has any questions, please speak right up. Please interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question.
I had a question. I guess this is for any of you really, but we've talked a lot tonight about white middle-class women, especially in Fort Collins, being the primary advocates for women having the vote, but primarily excluding women of minorities. I'm just wondering when we started to bridge that gap and when the two groups started to work together, because I feel like we definitely do more so today.
Who would like to take this question? Anybody?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that gap has been quite bridged yet. I think that Yeah, I'm trying to think about where I've seen that gap bridge, and I don't know that it has been. Right? I don't know. Again, so here's the thing. The conceptualization of womanhood, right, that white middle class and even elite women had is very particular, right? And that notion of womanhood doesn't include other women. And so that singular analysis that, that gender is a way to sort of understand oppression is something that mitigates against coming together. And so when we talk about intersectional perspectives, that's why we do, right? Because there are different ways that one arrives at womanhood. That's not just through gender, that is, you arrive at through race as well, or through class, right? So I'm not sure I've seen a lot of activism. So, again, I think women of color, because of the historical context and treatment that they've received, don't necessarily come out in droves, right, around this. And in fact, the National Women's Studies Association put out a statement, right, for the 100th anniversary, talking about the exclusions, right? So I'm not sure that we're in a place yet that it's not still exclusionary. And considering the sort of so going from 53% to 55%, right, in terms of how white women voted in this last election, I don't know. I think that the gap is widening, not closing.
Leslie or Patty, did you want to add anything to the question?
I think Dr. Souza hit it on the nose. Thank you.
I mean, there are examples, of course, of cross-racial and cross-identity coalitions going back to the second wave, the beginning of the second wave feminist movement. But I think, is it Lincoln? Is that your name? Lincoln, your question is really apt. Intersectionality has always been a really difficult thing for feminism, because feminism is, of course, a movement that purports to sort of represent the interests of half the entire human population. And that's a big group of people, right? And that's a group of people who don't necessarily have a whole lot in common with one another other than being female. So this is something that I think modern feminism still struggles with today very much, as Dr. Souza suggested. It looks like our chat is open. If anybody wants to type any questions into the chat, if you feel more comfortable asking questions that way, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, I might have to ask another question myself. Patty, I was going to ask you a question. How did you come to start Living Her Legacy? Would you tell us a little bit about the background of your organization in Fort Collins?
Yes, thank you for asking. In 2013, I was in Denver at the convention center at some meeting, took a wrong turn to get to my car, where I park in the same place every time so I can find my car. And as you walk east past the Big Blue Bear, there is an overhang, which is a service drive along the east side of the convention center. And there were, as I went through there, I counted the beautiful mosaic portraits on the wall. There were 80 of them, 40 women and 40 men, and with no sign to tell you what they were for. So I got home, and a couple months later, I looked it up, and it's called the Colorado Panorama. And a woman artist was commissioned from 1989 to 1991 to create those beautiful 80 portraits. And those 80 individuals helped create the foundation of the state of Colorado. So a couple months later, I looked it up again and thought, well, if they can do that in Denver, why can't we do that in Fort Collins and just recognize women? Because I've been in the Zonta Club of Fort Collins 10 years, and our mission is supporting girls and women to live a healthy life, educated, successful, and violence-free. And so it was very much working with young women is in my heart from all my years of my life. And so that's how it got started. And in December of 2013, I called Kathy Gilliland, who had been in politics for many years in Northern Colorado, and she had been the MC for our Zonta luncheon fundraiser the first 2 years. That's how I met her, by asking her to be our MC. So I met with her in December and said, I have this little idea. What do you think it's worth pursuing? And she sent me to meet with Matt Robinault, who's currently and is still the executive director of the Downtown Development Authority, because he was her employee when she was the mayor of Loveland. So that's how it started.
That's great. That's great. That's a great example of more sort of the legacy of Fort Collins grassroots women's organizing. That's terrific. Thanks, Patty.
You're welcome.
It looks like we've got some questions in the chat, and this is for anybody on the panel here, I think. Beth Goodmistad would like to know, with women being able to vote in 1920, were there significant or noticeable changes to political campaigns or political messages? I don't know if any of you know anything about national politics or local politics, you know, how it, you know, moving forward from 1920, but anything you know, please share.
I don't know a lot, but from the things that I read, there was a huge turnout when women had the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And that made changes just in itself, but women were took advantage of the fact that they were able to vote. Caridad or Leslie, do you know more about that?
Now I want to dig into that question, the question about political messages, whether the language or the main causes of political parties changed after 1920. I don't feel like I can answer your question, but I want to. That might have to be my next project.
I feel like I have a distant memory in my mind that Democrats were concerned because Warren Harding they considered to be a very good-looking man, and that they were worried that all the women would want to vote for Warren Harding because he was good-looking. I can't see it myself, but you know, that's stupid. But in any case, that's the only thing I've ever heard about in terms of any kind of crafting of messages. I mean, to go back to, I think it was Lincoln's question. I think the sad thing is that in many respects, the worst predictions of what women's suffrage would do never came true, in that it actually didn't change American politics very much, because as we know, women are all members of, you know, specific ethnicities, specific racial groups, and in general, women tend to vote along with their racial and ethnic categories much more so than as a block as women.
So there's some work among African-American historians about African-American women, right? And the sort of the struggle for the vote and the ways in which voting happened collectively or collaboratively. That is, because again, you know, men were going to cast votes. They had these conversations, these larger conversations that were community conversations. And this is Deborah Gray White and a few other of the African-American historians who talk about more community-oriented voting, where people got together, debated who to vote for and how to vote, right? When they did get, you know, when they could, and then voted collaborative kinds of ways, right? As opposed to what happens with white women who just vote with their husbands, right? Or their families. So there's a conversation, it's more, again, this participatory democracy sort of model of thinking about communities, thinking through issues and understanding, right, the racialized nature of voting, and then also the kinds of concerns that specific racialized ethnic groups have, and voting, you know, in the interest of the community.
Yes, thank you. We have another question from the chat. This is specifically for Leslie. Mark Davis wants to know, how was the suffrage movement received by husbands or other men in Fort Collins? What kind of sort of local support or lack of support did the men show?
There, you actually see a few married couples who were who were a part of the Equal Suffrage Association. So you see some of the female leaders of the WCTU, you see their husbands campaigning for the referendum. So there definitely was support from men in Fort Collins. We know the majority of men in Fort Collins or Larimer County ended up being in favor of women's suffrage because they voted for it in 1893. So pretty positive. I didn't come across, I was actually expecting to come across a little bit more hostility or resistance to women's suffrage around 1893, and it didn't happen. There are some jokes being made that follow a line typical gender stereotypes. So at that Jubilee party, after the referendum was passed, there's a joke being made about how it's going to be hard to get women to register to vote because they're not going to want to tell people their age. So there are kind of jokes being made, but not in Fort Collins. There didn't seem to be that much outright hostility to the passage of women's suffrage.
Oh, interesting. Caridad, did you see, it looks like you saw the latest question. Would you like to answer that? Maybe announce it to the group?
Okay, so the question is, are there major similarities between Latinx suffrage movement and the current debate struggle of Puerto Ricans to get the same voting rights and to be seen as properly as citizens and to get the same privileges? So first, Latinx suffrage movements, again, were various, right? They were varied because under that category are a number of different national ethnic groups, right? So Mexican Americans, who were also at some point in our history considered Spanish Americans, Mexican Americans, etc., and even sometimes white, right, had very particular sort of struggles around enfranchisement, and that's in the Southwest, particularly Texas, Arizona, to some extent. California, specifically Southern California, right? There are struggles around enfranchising people of Mexican origin. In the Northeast, we have Puerto Ricans, Cubans primarily, right? In the beginning of the late 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. And so those groups have a different relationship. Puerto Ricans, there are Puerto Ricans on the island, right? Who were through the Jones Act of 1917, given, or I don't know, I guess, I don't know how you talk about the fact that, I guess, imposed. So citizenship was imposed. They don't vote in our elections. They only, again, so we are called a quote unquote Commonwealth in Puerto Rico. And those people on the island don't vote. They have like a mock vote, but they don't actually vote. They have 2 representatives that go to Congress who don't also vote either, right? They are, for all intents and purposes, a colony, right? We call it a Commonwealth, but they don't have any real power. So they vote in their local elections, they vote for a governor, and they vote for their own sort of legislator, the bicameral legislator. The people in the United States, however, like me, people who are born here, we obviously vote. And do we constitute a voting bloc in the same way that, for example, Mexican Americans do? To a certain extent. We're not as numerous, right? There are only 2.7 Puerto Ricans here and 2.9 on the island. So there's not that many of us generally. And so the struggles there's some similarities, especially here in the United States. And then, of course, there are differences because the people on the island don't vote, right? And they don't also pay taxes, right? Because, no taxation without representation, right? But, that is, they don't pay federal taxes. They pay taxes on the islands in different ways. So there is, again, some differences in terms of the different kinds of groups of people, newer immigrants, of course, right? And newer groups of immigrants, like people from Nicaragua, from Central and South America, have a different sort of relationship also to voting. Hope that helped. I'm not sure, Megan. Tell me.
Thanks, that was terrific. Very knowledgeable. Puerto Rican statehood, I wonder if we'll be hearing more about that soon on a national level. We have time for one more question. Megan says it did. Thank you. It helped very much. Thanks, Megan. We have time for one more question, and that is from a current public history graduate student, Natalie Stacker. She asks, for the entire panel, when crafting historical or art exhibits about the women's suffrage movement, do you have any suggestions for do's and don'ts? Very good, practical public history question.
I'll start. If you're going to utilize individuals' pictures, I had to create contracts. I had to track down family members of deceased women, and I became a good sleuth. I've met every funeral home in town and in many other states to be able to track down relatives who could learn about their recognition and about signing this contract. And also, of course, I've been honored to meet all of the other women who are currently living in northern Colorado. But that would be one example of something that's very important to do before you put somebody's portraits or their faces out in public, is you need to have their permission.
Two other things come to mind. I think if you were making an exhibit, a big takeaway from this conversation tonight is being really specific with your language. So who exactly was campaigning how, who exactly was able to vote when, not using broad terms like suffragettes or women, but clarifying a little bit more. And then this is always a big question, I think, for doing any type of history, is figuring out where to stop the story. And it seems like it would be, in my opinion, to end an exhibit right at 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. It seems like it would be maybe a don't, but rather continuing that conversation further into time, so that people understand that it's an ongoing story would be really important to do in this case.
That's great advice. Thanks, Leslie. Caridad, would you like to add anything?
I don't have much more to add, just that in considering when you're doing the history of suffrage, that you also look at it as a movement, that often it's always individuals, right, that get talked about, as opposed to the fact that this was a larger movement, and to think about it, right, in movement terms.
All right, that's fantastic. Thanks, everybody. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Bo. Great questions. Thank you.
All righty. So that was a fantastic panel. Thank you, all three of you, very, very much for all your time and patience and corresponding over email and email tag. It was all very well worth it. And so that'll wrap up for tonight. If anyone is interested, this was put on by the CSU's History Club. We meet on Wednesday evenings at 5. If you would like to join us for that, you can email us at csuhistoryclub@gmail.com, and you can get the Zoom link. And we do a lot of fun events like this. There it is in the chat. Thank everyone for coming, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night. And thank you, Dr. Little, for being our wonderful moderator, helped us navigate things smoothly. And I hope to see everyone in the future in person sometime. Have a good night, everyone.